So, like Dimitri said, I'm Maxime, I work at Babylon, and today I'm going to talk to you about UI components and what we did to simplify the layouts in our apps. So first off, what do I mean by UI components? So we all start our Android apps the same way. We create a project on Android Studio, create a new project, and what we get from that is the basics of a design system. We get colors, text styles, dimensions, and on top of that, we also get views from the Android framework. So text view buttons, you can also create your own views if you wanted to, own custom views. And usually what we do is that when we need to create an app or a feature inside an app, we'll probably take some of those views, put them in a layout, and create those features. And our experience as Babylon is probably the same as all of you guys. So we usually start creating a feature, and as you can see here, you have a card with an image and a button. And then a few weeks later, we start creating a second feature. And usually we can see some patterns here. We can see that, well, it's kind of the same thing, but with another button. So what we used to do is kind of, well, let's create another layout, it's another feature, so whatever. We'll just create something else. And then we were getting maybe some different design, kind of getting almost the same layout, but with different colors this time, or different rounded corners on the card. And so if you take all of that, you quickly realize that you create layouts and create layouts all the time, right? And as you can imagine, the more you grow, the more you're going to get layouts and layouts that are hard to maintain. As you can see here, all the layouts are kind of the same, but kind of different at the time. And as you can imagine, the old UI is going to stay old because you won't update your old layouts, and the new UI will kind of looks like new. So at Babylon, we have more than 20 developers on the same code base, and as you can imagine, it can become quite scary to have so many layouts in the project. So we thought, well, maybe we can find a solution. Probably all in this room actually, probably all software engineers, and what we hate to do is to repeat ourselves. If it was Kotlin code, we will try to avoid rewriting stuff and always put some reusable code somewhere. And so usually when it's layout and when it's XML, we don't really care about that. We're going to create more and more XML layouts. And so we thought, well, maybe we can bridge the gap between having reusable views and having complex layouts and find an in-between. And this in-between for us is called UI components. So it's a user-friendly way to reuse UI. So what we did around 6 months ago is kind of go through our app and try to find common patterns. So as you can see here on the screen, we have kind of rows from different parts of the app that I all put on the same screen. And as you can see here, well, those rows, they kind of do the same thing, but some have a subtitle, some have an image, some don't have an image, some have an action on the right side, so at the end of the component. And one thing that you might not see at first sight is that all those components, so all those elements, are all inconsistent, and they also all come from different layouts in the project. So we started finding those common patterns inside the app, and so we talked to our design team. And turns out that our design team had the same problem as us. They were kind of copy-pasting inside their sketch file, but they didn't have a list of components that they could reuse easily. So what they did is that they went through the app and tried to find common patterns like we did, and created, as you can see here, a list of rows to keep the same example. And here we have kind of the same elements in different manners, and it's all elements that we need to create the user experience we have at Babylon. And so what we did with the Android team is to create those kind of UI components. So here you can see we have a list of rows with all different configuration, but they are all coming from the same layout, file. So how do we do that? Well, to create a row, it's quite simple. You can call row item, so that's how we call it, and just pass it some information. So the goal here is to try to abstract all the UI details. As you can see on the screen, the way it's laid out on the screen, you didn't say, well, I need that much padding between my title and my subtitle. You didn't add to. You just had to pass some information to it, the necessary information to be able to lay out this element on screen. So it's kind of looking the same way as some other modern frameworks that we've been looking at, like Flutter, for example. But it's also reminding you, if you've seen the announcement from Google last month about Jetpack Compose, it's a way to declaratively describe our UI and easily reuse our elements. So as you can see here on screen, you have a row item with a title, a subtitle, and an icon at the end. But if you wanted to have the icon at the start, well, it would be as simple as changing the way you call the item. And as you can see on screen, the icon is now at the start. You can also see that the icon is bigger because the start icon in our rows should be at a certain dimension. And so our engineers didn't have to think about, well, I need to know that the design should be like that. They can just reuse the item and they get all the design in there. So, well, I guess you all ask yourself, how did we make it? We had a few goals before starting this project. We were thinking, if we rework our UI, we should pay close attention to performance, right? We didn't want to make it easier for us, but make it worse for our users. We also wanted to have a delightful experience. In our app, we had some UI updates that were kind of senseless and sometimes not animating between themselves. And so we were thinking that we could find a way to, with those reusable elements, find a way to animate UI changes quite easily. And make it easy for our engineers as well. And the last point was ease of use. As I said, we wanted to be convenient for our engineers to work with that. So we have quite a big team, a big Android team, and we also hire quite a lot of people. New people are joining the team, so we didn't want them to have to learn a brand new framework just to be able to create a UI on our app. So with all those goals, we were thinking, well, if we want something easy to use, then we can maybe use some Android framework, something that already exists in Android. In performance, we were thinking maybe we need to recycle those elements, because if we have a screen with a lot of elements on screen, we're going to need some recycling. And with animation, we're thinking, but maybe a recycle view would work. We would get some recycling of those elements. We would get some animation, and it would be easy to use because it's a common Android API. The only downside of that was that, well, it's kind of a lot of boilerplate to write a recycler view. You need to write an adapter most of the time. You need to maybe write a diffutil implementation if you wanted to animate correctly. And so what we did is that we took all of that and we looked at libraries that would help us doing a bit nicer. And so we tried to use Groupie. So what we do with Groupie is that it's abstracting all the difficulties of recycler views. So you have a common adapter for all your screen, and each view holder can be, each item can be a view holder. And so it's quite easy to create UI elements just by creating new view holders. So let's take an example. Let's imagine we have a list of notifications, for example, and we want to create a screen that lists all the notifications. Well, what we can do is take those notifications and map them to a UI element. So here we're going to map them to a row item again, put the notification title in the title of the element, and pass some information. So when we have that, when we have this list of UI elements, the next step is going to be to call the adapter and call update. And as you can see on screen, you get the result of just adding those elements in the adapter. As you can see, we created a brand new feature with not touching to any XML lines. The component already exists. So it was quite easy to create all of that. So here, as you can see, we have a row item. And this row item doesn't know anything about being a notification itself. So the good thing here is that we avoid passing some domain details in the UI. The row item itself doesn't know about being a notification, so you need to prepare the data before passing it to the UI element. We very often could see that in recycler views, in your view orders, you could maybe map a date because it's convenient. So you receive a date, you map it quickly to be able to display it nicely on screen. Here what we're doing is that you need to prepare your information before you pass it to the UI element. And so it helps with separating the content here. And as you can see, we have a row item, but because it's quite easy to describe UI, you could replace it with a card item, and as you can see on screen, it would render as a card. So let's have a look at a component in detail. So the first thing is that we pass some information to this component. So we need to have some attributes that get all the information of each component. So here we have title, caption, and start icon. And as you can see, we have question marks on the two attributes. So we want to have as many optional attributes as possible. We want to try to avoid to make it hard for engineers to create an item. We want it to be simple. And so the minimum to create a card here is just to have a title. All the rest is optional, and you can just call just what you need. The second part is, well, we're using groupie. And so every view order needs to be an item. So that's how view orders are called in groupie, items. And by extending item, we need to override two methods. The first one is get layout. So as you can see here, we're still having XML layout. And so the good thing is that, well, we don't lose the knowledge of how to make a view in XML. We're just reusing them. So it's quite easy to create a new component. You don't need to be a UI master. You just create an XML layout, put it, give it in get layout, and you're done. The second method is bind. So bind is where we're going to bind all the data, exactly what you do in a general view order, where you put the data in the view. So one thing here is to remember that, well, all those views can be reused. And so when you bind the data, you should try not to have any irreversible action, right, on your layout. So we saw that, we created those elements, and the next thing that came up was, well, we want flexible inputs. As you can imagine, in Android, there are so many ways to pass information. You can pass a string, for example, just by passing a string ID from your resources, or you can have a string coming from your API, and so you have a Kotlin string. And so we quickly realized that we needed some flexibility here. So what we did is created a simple interface. We call it string value. We have the same to apply images to views. And it's quite simple. So here we have a string ID where we're going to pass a string ID. And it just applies it to the view. So it's quite flexible to pass information to a component. The component doesn't need to know about the way you're going to pass the information. And you can quite quickly create those classes. And so the last step is that, well, when you create a card item, you can pass your information in many different ways. So here, in the example, you can pass it as text, so a Kotlin string, and as a string ID with the string ID. The second part is, well, I talked about animations, right? And so we wanted the UI to animate its changes. We often have changes on the UI that is kind of unnoticed. And so the first thing that you can do to help diffutil manage these animations for you, well, the first thing is to make your class a data class. With Kotlin, when you make your class a data class, you get the hashcode and equals method for free. And so that helps diffutil to already see if two components are the same and how they should be animated on screen. The second part is in case you have stable IDs. So for example, our notifications come from the server with a stable ID. You can also pass an identifier to groupie. So here you can override getID and pass an identifier. And what it would do is basically, it would know that two items in between UI updates are the same. And so it would animate clearly on the screen. So as you can see here on the animation, some elements stay on screen because they have a stable ID, and others move when they enter the screen. The second point about recycler views is that, well, it's kind of flexible. As you can see here, we have a phone screen or a tablet screen, and with different layout managers, you can quite quickly change the way it looks. So here, the UI components stay the same. We're not changing them. The only thing we're doing is changing the layout manager and changing the number of columns in that layout manager. The second thing is item decorators. So recycler views give you an easy way to put margins around your element and have consistent margins all around, right? And so at the beginning, when we created UI items, we were thinking, should we add margin in the item itself, or should we leave item decorators doing its job? And yeah, you can just leave the item decorators and create your own item decorators to have consistent margin all across the board. Having different item decorators as well and layout managers make it flexible for anyone using your components to display them as they wish. So here are quick tips about UI components. The first thing is, well, we're using a recycler view under the hood, so they are reused, and so we need to be careful writing our bind method, right? The second thing is be mindful of Android views at all the states. As you can imagine, for example, an edit text will remember the place of the cursor. So the moment you will reuse it, you would have some surprises. So be mindful of that and make sure that you handle your states correctly. So where do you start if you want to do that in your company? So if you want to create those UI components to be able to reuse as much as you can of your UI. Well, the first step for us was to communicate with our team. We started at just the Android team, but we quickly realized that with our designers, we had the same problem, and our iOS team and our web team all followed the lead of using those components to have the same way of talking about UI. So it makes it easier for everyone, and everyone can help as well. The second point is, well, you can easily create a component list. Here, it's just a recycler view with some of our components inside. And so it makes it quite easy for designers to be able to see, well, I want to see what a row looks like on Android and how I can interact with it. It's good for developers as well. They can see what they have to create UI, and they can see the implementation as well. And the last point is be careful of flexibility. So you can create components and you can make them very complex very quickly. So here, avoid creating monsters, avoid creating a class with 1,000 attributes. Be mindful of that. So it's quite easy to start adding and adding to your components until it becomes so hard to maintain that no one wants to use them. So be mindful of that. So the key takeaway for us at Babylon was basically that, well, designers can now work on UX problems instead of UI details. They don't need to think about what is the padding between that and that. They can just use a component and they know that we will have it on our side on Android. The second point is that, well, devs can work in Kotlin instead of fight XML. Sometimes it's really hard to debug XML, and so having to describe your UI in Kotlin, it's usually a bit nicer. And the last point, well, our QA can test our UI components very quickly. So if you have a card, for example, that behaves wrongly on API 21 or whatever, it's very easy to install the app, look at the list of components, and see how things behave on different versions of Android or different brands of smartphone. As you can imagine, if you need to find a screen inside the app, it gets very complex very quickly. So for our QA, it's very easy for them to focus on the logic, and they know that we're reusing the UI, so they have less to look for on the UI. So yeah, that's pretty much it for me. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll be happy to answer your questions.